Sorry about that. I pressed escape, which ends the video, and I just wanted to get out of the slideshow. So, right, we're back. So this is now Ozymandias lesson part 2. So it's slightly different this week. I really didn't want to re-record the whole thing that I've recorded. So, as I was saying, we're now going to watch the animation of the Ozymandias poem. Okay.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fell, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
So quite dramatic, that reading. But I think it's quite nice to have the images at the same time as we have the poem read to us. So as I said, I'd like you to make sure that you've now read that yourself. So I read it, I want you to watch that animation and now read it through yourself. So if you need to go back, pause and have a read through this. What I will do is upload this slide as well as a Word document onto Go for Schools. So if you have access to a printer, you can print it off, or you can just download it and have it next to the video of this lesson as you go. And it might be useful to annotate it or just have it there for reference. So make sure you've listened to me read it, listened to the YouTube clip and read it through yourself at least once. Wrong way. And then answer these questions. Who do you hear in the voice of the poem? And what story do you see in the narrative? So I'd pause the video after you've had a thought. You can restart and we'll just discuss some of the possible answers. So who do you hear in the voice of the poem? Do you hear Percy Shelley? Does it sound like somebody that believes in freedom and less oppression and nature? And if so, why? Maybe some of the language, the words that are used in that poem. And who do you see in the narrative? What story do you see in the narrative? So what is this poem about? So we've got 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. So it's set in the desert. Near them on the sand, yep, definitely a desert. Half sunk, a shattered visage lies. So we need to think, what does visage mean? Whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. So this image of this visage means a face, who is frowning. They've got a wrinkled lip like an angry sneer. So it doesn't sound like a happy sculpture that's standing in the desert. So tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. So it tells us on line 2, the 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. So we could see in that clip that there was just 2 legs of a statue left, and then the face was lying on the floor. So what survives of this statue, or of this ruler, maybe, that the statue represented? What's the message? So look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Is there any irony there? That this was what he wanted people to remember him by, and yet what situation is he in now? And then the lone and level sands stretch far away, which makes it sound very endless and a never-ending situation that this sculpture's in. So not a cheery, optimistic poem, I would argue. So who was Ozymandias? What is this poem about? So he was Ramesses II, so it's another name for Ramesses II, and he was the king of Egypt in the 13th century, so 1200 BC. And he commissioned a sculpture to make a statue of himself with the inscription, "Look on my works, ye mighty and despair." So this sculpture wasn't made at the request of other people to honour somebody. He wanted to make it for himself. He wanted people to remember him. And how do we think he wanted them to remember him? So, "Look on my works, ye mighty and despair." Do you think he wanted them to think, "Oh, what a nice guy he was. He was a great ruler. He really looked after us. He was a friendly sort of fella"? Or maybe was he a bit of a tyrant? "You should be afraid of me. Look on me and despair. Look at what I've achieved." Was he boastful? Was he arrogant? Was he proud? Was he humble? I'm not sure. And we need to consider, why would such a powerful ruler want such a thing? Have we already mentioned it? Is he arrogant? Does he want to have people to remember that he's always going to be there, that he had this power? Although we know that isn't true. You can't last forever. And in theory, somebody's legacy will only last so long. It will only last as long as people are around to tell it and pass on that story. And we know Chinese whisper stories, they change as they get passed across the generations. So we need to be thinking in the back of our minds while we read this poem, why would such a powerful ruler want a statue made of himself to say these words? What message was he trying to give to people that found, saw, visited this statue? Now, your first task, written task, that I want you to get to grips with is look at these 10 following statements and think which out of these statements apply to the poem. And I want you to then write a short paragraph for each of the statements that you choose, each of the 3, and then justify using quotes from the poem as evidence. So what words, what quotes from that poem make you think that that applies to this poem? Now, it says there in white in the green task box, I want you to make sure that you've read the poem at least 3 times, and then I want you to try and do a paragraph for each of the statements that you found. So these are the statements. So, does the poem explore power and status? Is the poet admiring Ozymandias? Does he have admiration for him? Ozymandias was once a proud and tyrannical ruler. Do we think he was a proud, tyrannical ruler? The poem suggests that we all have time, we have all the time in the world, so we have plenty of time, we don't need to worry, we'll be around forever. Does the poem suggest that? Is the poem about legacies, so things that we leave behind, memories, things that we give to the world, and what we leave behind after we die? So does it have any element of that to it? Does the poet suggest that pride becomes before a fall? Is the poem about time and nature and how man cannot conquer either? So is there any natural nature references in that poem? I think there might be. Does Shelley suggest that art and language will outlast humans and other legacies of power? So are there any clues in there that maybe art and language or words are the only things that have remained over a legacy of power? And is the reader left to imagine the sculptor as well as Ozymandias' character? So does it tell us much about the sculptor? Or do we need to kind of construct in our own minds, from what we've learnt from the poem, who this sculptor might have been, and why he was chosen to create a sculpture? And is there any irony here that the sculptor's legacy will last and that Ozymandias' power won't? So that links to question 9 about who the sculptor might be. So is there any irony there that his legacy, his sculpture has lasted, albeit fallen apart slightly, whereas Ozymandias' power hasn't? He's no longer with us. He no longer rules over a set of people. So take a few minutes to decide which 3 you'd like to choose there. There is more than 3 that could be applied to the poem, but choose 3 that you think you could have evidence for, and then we will come back and explore which ones you might have chosen. So pause the video and return when you're ready. Okay, so hopefully you've had a look at those, read through this poem a good few times now, and come up with 3 statements from this list of 10 that you feel apply to the poem Ozymandias. So the first one that you could have chosen would be that the poem explores power and status. So the fact that it was a statue of what we assume was a ruler by the way that he describes himself, look at my works, ye mighty, and despair. That could be something. And the status that he feels that he has. So what does he think about himself? Maybe what sort of status do others give to him? So how do they feel about him as a ruler? The poet, I don't feel, admired Ozymandias at all. So number 2 wouldn't apply. Number 3, Ozymandias was once a proud tyrannical ruler. I would argue that he was. Yeah, and there is proof there. Number 5, the poem is about legacies and what we leave behind after we die. So very much so, what's left behind after Ozymandias or Ramesses II has died is this statue. What message has been left behind? What legacy? Is there a message? What does it tell us about what we leave behind after we die? So what quotes could you find from the poem that would reference that? The poet, number 6, does suggest that pride comes before a fall. I would say I think to commission a statue of yourself, which we know Ramesses II, or aka Ozymandias, did. He commissioned this statue. He wanted this statue to be made of himself. Definitely shouts that this guy was proud of himself. He thought a lot of himself. He wanted to be remembered. It would be a bit like going to an artist and saying, "Can you paint a self-portrait of me, please? I feel I deserve it. I want people to remember me in my best light. I want to be there forever and never forgotten," with this message at the bottom. So I think definitely pride becomes a fall before the fall. So if you're too proud, are you kind of setting yourself up for a fall? Are you setting yourself up to be undermined and for failure? What was Ozymandias' fall? How is that presented in this poem? The poem is about time and nature and how man cannot conquer either. Now, we know that Ramesses II, or Ozymandias, was from a long, long time ago, much longer than even Shelley was, much further back in history than even Shelley, who wrote the poem. So this statue has lasted the test of time. However, it is not in the best of health now. So how might time and nature be demonstrated in the poem that man cannot conquer either of those things? So what references do we have to time, or hints about time, and what references to nature or the natural world? Shelley does suggest that art and language will outlast humans and other legacies of power. How does he do that? You could argue that the artistic creation of the sculpture itself has lasted much longer than Ozymandias' legacy. So that sculpture is still there. It's a piece of art. It was created by a skilled craftsman, a sculptor at the time. And that's lasted, whereas the power and control that Ozymandias once had and the tyrannical rule that he led by, that's no longer there. And language, so the words on his sculpture are still there. That message is still there. However, it probably has a sense of irony to it now, that he's saying, look at me and despair, and actually what he is now is just a broken statue in a desert surrounded by sand. The reader is left to imagine about the sculptor as well as Ozymandias' character. So it doesn't tell us a lot about the guy, the female, I presume a guy, who created this sculpture, and it only hints at Ozymandias. So we only know that he was Ramesses II, from the power of Google, really. Somebody's found that out. But if we were to just read the poem itself, it wouldn't tell us that he was that person. Is there any irony that the sculpture's legacy will last and not Ozymandias' power? So yeah, definitely. So as we said, this sculptor created this piece of art. This is what he will be remembered by. His contribution to the world was this, maybe other statues. Whereas Ozymandias, I mean, I'm sure he contributed lots of other things, but he wanted to be remembered, as we see from this statue, as mighty, as powerful. He wanted people to despair at the thought of him and really see him as this controlling, scary ruler. We now see that actually his legacy is not there. His legacy of power and control and despair and tyranny is gone. But the sculptor's legacy of the creative nature of himself, his expression, his craft, his time, his effort, his skill, that legacy is still there. So there's an irony there. What we need to think about as well is what status would these two men have had in the Egyptian world at the time. So Ozymandias, or Ramesses II, he was a ruler. He would have lived in palaces with slaves, not even just servants, slaves that didn't get paid. He would have literally ruled with an iron fist. Egyptian society was very cutthroat in a lot of ways. You know, if you were the king, you called the shots, you really could do what you wanted. You weren't really answerable to anybody. Whereas the sculptor, would he have had that luxurious life? I'm guessing probably not. I'm very sure he didn't sculpt this on his own. He would have had a team of people working for him. They would have led an even less glamorous life. Therefore, is there that irony that this man who was, although incredibly skilled, he was probably relatively poor in the grand scheme of things, of Egyptian society. His legacy, his sculpture has much outlasted Ozymandias' power. So what does that tell us about the power of art over power, tyranny, control? And what might Percy Shelley be telling us, which is more important? Okay. So I want you to choose 3 of those that have ticks next to them, and now write your short paragraph for each of them. Justify using quotes from the poem. So give yourself a good half an hour to do that. When you're done, come back to the poem, come back to the lesson, sorry. So pause it now. Okay, so I'm hoping you've now written some paragraphs about the 3 statements that you think apply to the poem. I'd like you to have written that either on a Word document or in your book and send them to me. Now your next task is to annotate the poem or make notes or list down examples of the following. Now you'll see sections of the poem as we go through this, and I want you to use those questions to help guide you with your annotations or your notes. So I'm going to do minimal reading and giving you ideas about what to write around the poem. I want you to really do this yourself. But you can obviously stop and start the film as you go and have a look also at the text if you're able to print it off yourself, and use the notes and the questions as we go. So some of the things I want you to look for are language techniques and different uses of words. So what images are created of desolation and destruction? Are there any references to nature or natural features? Are there any pairs of adjectives? What alliteration can you find? Make sure you look at the structure. So is there any repetition? What rhythm do we have? Is there any caesura, enjambment, end stopping? And if you want to have a go at the challenge, look at the form. What type of poem is this? Do you know what we would call this? And does it break any poetic conventions? So this is how it's going to be presented. So there's 4 slides with sections of the poem. So I would go through, I'd read that section. So I met a traveller from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown. Now, I've put some questions around the edge. So what does the word antique suggest? So you could either write the question next to the poem or some notes and then write the answer, or you could just put the word antique, suggest that this land is old, ancient, maybe was once something very beautiful and polished, whereas now it's aged and shows signs of that. It could be something that once was very valuable, but now, because of the damage, has lost its value. what's trunkless? What does trunkless mean, and what does it suggest about the statue? So if you were trunkless, your body's trunk is your torso. So we can see in that image that we saw before, have we seen it or not? Just whiz back. I'm going to find that we haven't. Yes, here. So this is a kind of good image of Ozymandias as we see in the poem. So he has 2 legs and he has a head, but there is no torso. So in that section of text, let's through again. What does trunkless mean? It means there's no torso. What does it suggest about the statue? Why is there no torso? What might that be symbolic of? 2 trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown. Now what is a shattered visage? What's a visage? So Google that. What is a visage? What does shattered mean? Why is it shattered? Look that up. And what does the word frown suggest about the subject of the statue? So we've already said, what character are we thinking about to be if he had a frown on his face on this statue? Why did he not want to be sculptured looking happy? Why did he want to be remembered with a frown? So pause this, answer those questions, then do the same for this slide, and this slide, and this slide. So pause and rewind to each slide. I would say this should probably take you a good 40 minutes, 30 minutes to 40 minutes again. And once you've had a go, come back to the video and we will have a look again. Okay, so if you had a go at the challenge of what form is this poem is something that we call a sonnet, which is a love poem, or it's normally about love. Shakespeare wrote a lot of sonnets. Now, is there any irony here? So, if this poem is a sonnet, which is usually about love, does it sound like Shelley loved this statue? Okay. If not, who might have loved who? Was there an element of self-love? Sonnets are usually about 14 lines long, so they're not very long. There's an alternate rhyme scheme, so every other line rhymes, and then followed by a rhyming couplet. Now, there is inevitably something called iambic pentameter, or pentameter, if you've never heard of that. It's something that Shakespeare used to write in. And this is an example here in the white box. So, iambic pentameter has around 10 syllables per line. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Or another way of showing this, if you have a look at the U's and the slashes, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? If you count those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I was worried then there might not have been 10. 10 syllables for that line. Again, thou art more lovely and more temperate. 10 again. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. 10 there. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. 10 there. So it has an iambic pentameter. And then it has a volta around line 9. What is a volta? Now it's an Italian word for turn. So in a sonnet, the volta is the turn of thought or argument. So it's a change of tone, a change of direction of the poem, and it's usually about line 9. So nearer the end of the poem, it usually twists a little bit. So maybe it's slightly surprising, a little bit unexpected, just changes the direction that the poem was going in. So now let's have a quick look again. We're going to whiz back to this poem. I want it to be on the one where we have the slide with it all there. Okay. I met a traveller from an antique land. Right, if you go traveller, that's 11. If you go traveller, that's 10. So we've got some iambic pentameter. Where's our volta? Where does it change direction? So it talks about what the traveller has found, the statue. Then it talks about what the statue looks like. Then here, on line 10 or 9, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, it is on line 9. I counted that about 3 or 4 times. It changes direction and it starts to talk to us about what words, what message this sculpture wanted us to read. So that's your Volta in this poem there. Do we have an alternate rhyme scheme? So yes, we do. So first line, and traveller from an antique land. Third line, stand in the desert, blah, 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 on the sand. So you've got land, sand, command. Okay, then you've got things. Then you've got appear, despair, similar sound, bear, away, decay, bed, red, frown, stone. Some of them aren't direct rhymes, stone and frown, but you make the similar shape with your mouth, so they're a similar sound to the words. So there are quite a few elements of the poem that suggest that this is a sonnet, which is ironic because it's a love poem and it was written by a follower of the Romantic movement, romance, love. But as we said, it's good to think here, I'm not sure that Percy Shelley himself had love or admiration for Ozymandias. However, is he writing it because Ozymandias had love and admiration for himself? So, is it kind of mocking, through a sonnet, the love that this ruler had for himself? So it's kind of flipped it on its head a little bit, the use of the sonnet and why they would use them. Now your third task, I would like you to answer the following questions using full sentences. Question 1. What does the poem suggest about the power of nature? So this is a really key theme in this poem. Throughout the anthology that I spoke about at the start of this film, there are many poems that reference the power of nature. So it's definitely a theme that will be common in many of the poems. It may be something that you also talk about at GCSE in one of your exams. So it's very good to get the idea of how nature comes into these poems and how the poets want to deliver that message that maybe nature has more power than we do, than what is going on in the world, etc. So anyway, to answer the first question, what does the poem suggest about the power of nature? And your second question, what does the poem suggest about Shelley's attitudes towards oppressive, tyrannical behaviours of those in power? So we've spoken before, do we think he admired this leader? We've seen in the slide about Shelley, does he like that sort of rule and leadership and politics? Does he? No, he doesn't. So what does this poem suggest about his attitudes? Also think about how we just said that although this is a sonnet, which is a love poem about this ruler, does the language in the poem suggest that Shelley has love for the ruler, or is he mocking this ruler through the use of a sonnet, through the use of a love poem to say, look, this guy loved himself? Okay, so there's a lot in these two questions. So in the blue star, just some little cues as to how to answer these questions. So the poem suggests that, so if we're doing question 1, the natural world is more powerful than the world of mankind. The quote, choose a quote, shows or demonstrates this because, and then tell me what you need to tell me. Now I'm aware this is the first time you've looked at poetry in this way and this particular set of poems, but just give it your best shot. If you have any questions, contact me. The best thing for you to do is to make sure you read through this poem at least 3 times to really get to grips with what it is. Google about the poem, use that access to the internet that you hopefully have to your advantage here. Look up about Percy Shelley, what else can you find out? What else can you find out about the poem itself? So yeah, do a bit of background reading. This slide is just a kind of revision slide, summary of the things that we've just looked at. This is due a week today, so Wednesday the 1st of July. So as I've just said, contact me with any questions. Yeah, take care and give it your best shot. I have every faith in you all.